Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, Project Blue Book, 1952. The professionalization of denial, Project Blue Book, and the Ruppelt era. The transition from the overtly dismissive Project Grudge to Project Blue Book in 1952 was not a change of heart, but a tactical recalibration. By 1952, the phenomenon had become too pervasive, and the reports too high-profile, for the military to maintain the charade that UFOs were merely mass hallucinations or weather balloons. The institution needed a new front, one that looked scientific, rigorous, and objective to regain the trust of a skeptical public and an anxious Congress. The tipping point was the Washington National Airport sightings of July 1952. Over 2 consecutive weekends, unidentified targets were tracked by both civilian and military radar and simultaneously witnessed by air traffic controllers and commercial airline pilots, hovering directly over the U.S. Capitol and the White House. When F-94 interceptors were scrambled to confront them, the objects accelerated away with performance characteristics that no human craft could match. The ensuing media frenzy made the government's nothing-to-see-here stance under Project Grudge seem not just inaccurate but dangerous. The Air Force had lost the narrative, and public trust in their competence was at an all-time low. To stabilize the situation, the Air Force appointed Captain Edward J. Ruppelt to lead the newly formed Project Blue Book. Ruppelt was not a believer in the fringe sense. He was a methodical, data-driven intelligence officer who realized that the debunking approach of Project Grudge was intellectually dishonest and operationally useless. An Air Force intelligence officer, World War II veteran, and aeronautical engineer, Ruppelt didn't just investigate UFOs, he literally coined the term UFO, unidentified flying object, to replace the sensationalized and dismissive term flying saucer. As the director of the Air Force's Official Investigation Unit in the early 1950s, Ruppelt walked the razor-thin line between military censorship, scientific inquiry, and the profound weirdness of the anomalous skies. When the U.S. Air Force established its first formal UFO investigations, starting with Project Sign in 1947, which briefly morphed into Project Grudge, the military was drowning in unorganized witness reports, hoaxes, and internal skepticism. Grudge, in particular, suffered from a demoralized staff that dismissed nearly every sighting as weather balloons, mass hysteria, or psychological aberration, simply to close out case files. Recognizing that the military was failing to handle mounting public pressure and credible military reports, especially following waves of sightings over sensitive areas like Oak Ridge and Washington, D.C., the Air Force needed a serious analytical leader. In 1951, Captain Ruppelt was appointed to take over the struggling project, effectively rebranding, restructuring, and supercharging it under a new code name, Project Blue Book. Ruppelt brought a refreshing, no-nonsense engineering mindset to the role. He demanded that investigators drop their emotional bias, apply rigorous criteria, and treat witness reports, especially those from commercial airline pilots, radar operators, and military personnel, with scientific seriousness. Under Ruppelt's directorship, Project Blue Book experienced its most active and transparent era. He believed that if anomalous craft were operating in American airspace, they needed to be studied objectively, whether they were secret Soviet tech, natural phenomena, or something truly extraterrestrial. When Captain Edward J. Ruppelt took command of the Air Force's Official Investigation Unit in 1951, he inherited a public relations and intelligence disaster. The skies above America, from the atomic reactors of Hanford and Oak Ridge to the test ranges of New Mexico, were swarming with anomalous objects, and the media was in a feeding frenzy. To regain control of the narrative, Ruppelt executed one of the most successful semantic rebrandings in modern history. He officially discarded flying saucer and coined the acronym UFO. In the wake of Kenneth Arnold's June 1947 sighting, the term flying saucer immediately captured the global imagination, but it came with a debilitating double-edged sword for military investigators. The phrase evoked pulp magazines, Bug-Eyed Monsters, and Buck Rogers serials. Whenever a commercial pilot, military general, or civilian reported seeing an anomalous craft, the media immediately painted them through a lens of mockery or hysteria. By forcing every anomalous sighting into the rigid visual box of a saucer, the term blinded witnesses and investigators to other configurations, triangles, cigars, glowing orbs, and delta wing shapes. It also created an immediate defensive barrier within the scientific community, who refused to touch a subject wrapped in such tabloid sensationalism. When Captain Edward J. Ruppelt deliberately sidelined the sensationalism of flying saucers in favor of unidentified flying object, UFO, he was engaging in a profound exercise of linguistic engineering. Language shapes reality, and in the high-stakes corridors of post-war military intelligence, the wrong words could trigger public panic, congressional investigations, or scientific ridicule. To transform a chaotic national security crisis into a manageable administrative file, the new terminology had to sound like something the federal government already knew how to process: logistics, science, and bureaucracy. The genius of the acronym UFO lay in how closely it mimicked existing, mundane government nomenclature. In the mid-century military apparatus, terms like unidentified ground vehicle, UGV, unidentified watercraft, or standard meteorological designations were part of everyday reporting. By structuring the acronym to mirror standard military and aviation reporting categories, Ruppelt stripped the phenomenon of its cosmic terror. A flying saucer sounded like an invasion from Mars, an unidentified flying object sounded like a bureaucratic line item on an air traffic control manifest. It implied that the object, while currently lacking a positive ID, was still part of a known physical universe that the military's administrative machinery was fully equipped to categorize, track, and file away. When Captain Edward J. Ruppelt orchestrated the transition from descriptive nouns to an epistemic status, he did more than just clean up public relations semicolon. He executed a fundamental shift in how the military apparatus conceptualized reality. By recasting anomalous phenomena as a logistical status rather than a physical object, the Air Force weaponized epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, turning an existential terror into a manageable algebraic equation. For the first 4 years of the modern UFO era, 1947 to 1951, the public and the media were trapped in a primitive taxonomic loop. Every report was forced into a physical classification. Is it a saucer? Is it a disc? Is it a cigar? This noun-based approach short-circuited rigorous investigation. If a witness reported a glowing triangle or a soundless geometric matrix, it didn't fit the flying saucer template, leading to immediate skepticism or dismissal. Worse, it assumed a conclusion. Calling something a saucer implied it was a manufactured solid craft before any data had been analyzed. The term unidentified flying object, UFO, completely severed the phenomenon from its physical appearance. It moved the inquiry away from what the object looks like and shifted it entirely to what we know about it. Unidentified is not a physical description. It is a statement of epistemic limitation. It declares, we possess sensory data, but our current categorical framework lacks a positive match. By framing the phenomenon as an open variable, Ruppelt Project Blue Book integrated anomalous sightings into the standard operational workflow of systems engineering and military intelligence. The investigative process was effectively mapped onto a formal logical progression. Step 1. Object detected, the baseline trigger. A radar return on a scope at Oak Ridge, a visual flash over the Pajarito Plateau, or a pilot sighting over a missile silo enters the system as a raw anomaly. Step 2. Data collected, the accumulation of empirical metrics. Altitude, speed, radar cross-section, acoustic profile, weather conditions, and witness credibility are gathered into a standardized case file. Step 3. Variables analyzed, the comparative phase. Analysts cross-reference the data against known terrestrial variables, commercial flight paths, weather balloons, meteorological inversions, astronomical bodies like Venus, or classified spy planes like the U-2. Step 4. Identification achieved or filed as unknown, the terminal node of the equation. If the variables match a known terrestrial phenomenon, the case is closed, identified. If the variables defy every known category of human engineering and atmospheric physics, the equation does not break down into panic. Instead, it is cleanly filed into the designated bureaucratic bin. Unknown. This mathematical framing served a profound psychological and institutional purpose for the post-war military establishment. By treating the unknown as an open variable in an equation, the Air Force neutralized the existential dread of uninvited intrusion. You cannot negotiate with a terrifying, otherworldly invasion force, but you can analyze data points, run regression tests, and calculate probabilities on an unidentified flying object. The epistemic shift didn't just invent modern ufology's methodology, it built a cognitive firewall. It allowed scientists and intelligence officers to look directly into the abyss of non-human intelligence, process the data through a cold clinical framework, and file it away as a residual remainder, maintaining the illusion that human reason still held dominion over the skies. When Captain Edward J. Ruppelt engineered the shift toward clinical nomenclature, he was addressing a profound psychological crisis within the ranks of the United States military. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the men tasked with defending American airspace, combat-tested fighter pilots, veteran radar operators, and base commanders, faced a devastating professional dilemma. To report an impossible high-performance anomaly was to risk one's career, mental evaluation, and military standing. By reframing the unknown through a lens of strict technical precision, Ruppelt erected a psychological and professional shield that allowed the military apparatus to process the impossible without fracturing its own sanity. For an elite military aviator or a seasoned radar technician in the post-war era, credibility was the ultimate currency. Their world was governed by ballistics, aerodynamics, and strict chain of command logic. If a pilot returned to base and declared, "I chased a flying saucer," they instantly invited institutional ridicule, psychological fitness for duty boards, and the quiet derailment of their career. The cultural baggage of pulp science fiction meant that reporting a saucer was culturally synonymous with admitting to a hallucination or a mental breakdown. This social and professional stigma created a dangerous information bottleneck. Terrified of being branded as crackpots, many pilots, navigators, and radar crews simply chose to keep silent about the impossible objects they tracked over sensitive installations like Oak Ridge, Hanford, or the Pajarito Plateau. The military was flying blind precisely because its own personnel were afraid to speak the truth. Ruppelt's introduction of clinical terminology dismantled this paralyzing stigma by changing the nature of the confession. A pilot was no longer asked to believe in space invaders or validate a science fiction narrative. They were simply asked to report telemetry. Saying "I am vectoring toward an unidentified radar return" at 30,000 feet or visual sighting of an unclassified luminous object completely decoupled the report from personal belief. This linguistic shift acted as a vital cognitive shield. It allowed a hard-nosed, skeptical military officer to submit a detailed, harrowing report of a non-human craft outmaneuvering his jet without feeling like he was indulging in fantasy. It turned a bizarre, existential encounter into a standard flight log entry. By sanitizing the lexicon, the Air Force achieved a dual victory in institutional self-preservation. Had the military publicly validated that its pilots were regularly engaging unidentifiable craft that could outrun any jet and neutralize nuclear silos, public panic would have overwhelmed civil defense structures. The clinical neutrality of the UFO label kept the broader populace calm. It allowed the military hierarchy to ingest high strangeness data, route it through Project Blue Book, and file it away systematically without triggering a panic-induced breakdown of the defense apparatus. Neutralizing the irrational wasn't just a public relations trick. It was an operational necessity. By teaching the military to speak the language of cold clinical data rather than panicked folklore, Ruppelt ensured that the men guarding the atomic frontier could look into the impossible abyss of the skies, document what they saw, and remain standing. Ultimately, this linguistic framing achieved a masterclass in institutional self-defense. By making the terminology sound intensely sterile and clinical, the Air Force created a semantic cage around the phenomenon. It allowed Project Blue Book to process thousands of bizarre, high-strangeness encounters through the same dry administrative pipeline used for lost cargo or stray weather balloons. The sound of science wasn't just a PR strategy. It was a sophisticated operational filter designed to make the terrifying reality of uninvited, non-human intelligence look like just another day at the office. By shifting the nomenclature from a physical description, saucer, to an epistemic status, unidentified, Ruppelt decoupled the object from its pop culture baggage. A UFO was no longer a Martian spacecraft by default. It was simply a data point on a radar scope or a visual anomaly awaiting categorization. It allowed generals, scientists, and intelligence officers to discuss the inexplicable without losing their professional credibility. Beyond public relations, the rebranding served a vital institutional function. It allowed the Air Force to streamline how reports were processed, filed, and ultimately neutralized. Under the banner of UFOs, Project Blue Book could systematically funnel thousands of erratic, high-strangeness reports through a standardized bureaucratic checklist. Ironically, by making the terminology sound so mundane and administrative, Ruppelt successfully insulated the military's top brass. It created a linguistic buffer zone, allowing the Air Force to quietly investigate genuinely inexplicable, high-performance craft without admitting to the public that American airspace was completely vulnerable to non-human intelligence. Under Ruppelt, the project began using the scientific method as its primary tool. He insisted on interviewing witnesses personally, analyzing radar data, and utilizing a classification system to separate the easily explained from the truly unknown. However, while Ruppelt genuinely attempted to bring scientific integrity to the investigation, Blue Book remained fundamentally shackled to its original mission: public relations. Ruppelt and his team did legitimately catalog unknowns cases that defied every conventional explanation. However, there was a systemic internal pressure to keep the percentage of unknowns as low as possible. If a case couldn't be definitively proven to be a craft, it was to be labeled as possibly an aircraft, a bird, or psychological glitch. Ruppelt's project acted as a psychological buffer for the military. By creating a professional, long-running office that seemed to take every report seriously, they successfully pacified the public. If people knew a military office was investigating, they were less likely to demand deeper, more intrusive congressional hearings. By 1953, the internal politics of the Air Force shifted. The military establishment grew increasingly uncomfortable with Blue Book, validating too many unexplained sightings, leading to a push to debunk and downplay the phenomenon, culminating in the famous CIA-backed Robertson panel. Frustrated by the bureaucratic suppression of anomalous data, Ruppelt left the Air Force shortly thereafter. In 1956, Ruppelt published a landmark insider account, titled The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Unlike sensationalist paperbacks of the era, Ruppelt's book was written with the measured tone of an intelligence officer. He famously outlined the evolution of the military's investigations, dividing the history into eras where the phenomenon went from being treated as a serious national security puzzle to the bureaucratic nuisance. He admitted that while many sightings had prosaic explanations, a stubborn percentage, the truly unknowns defied all terrestrial logic, leaving open the profound possibility that Earth was being monitored by an intelligence beyond our world. Ruppelt himself eventually grew disillusioned, leaving behind a permanent testament to the tension between institutional survival and raw empirical truth. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt remains one of the most respected figures in the history of ufology. He approached a chaotic, ridiculed subject with the discipline of an engineer and the curiosity of a scientist. His tenure at Project Blue Book proved that beneath the layers of military denial and public skepticism, the men flying America's post-war skies knew that something extraordinary and entirely unearthly was sharing our airspace. The irony of Blue Book is that while it was designed to solve the problem and put the flying saucer hysteria to rest, it ended up becoming the repository for the most compelling, unexplainable, and terrifying encounters of the 20th century. By trying to professionalize the investigation, the Air Force inadvertently created a 17-year-long archive of evidence that, even under the strictest scrutiny of the time, could not be dismissed. Project Blue Book succeeded in its public relations mission. The government successfully downplayed the threat, but it failed in its technical mission, as it never could answer the fundamental question. What were they? It remains the ultimate example of a government investigation that was designed to reach a conclusion before the first case file was even opened. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown, Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact, The Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of real-life experiences, perfect for your daily plunge into consciousness exploration. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.